Vehicle is an artifact subtype that was introduced in 2016's Kaladesh. As the name would indicate, vehicles tend to be modes of transportation. All vehicles have power and toughness, but they aren't always creatures. Most of them have to be crewed to become creatures until end of turn. In other words, you tap any number of creatures with total power X or greater. In many ways, they're like super efficient creatures that you have to jump through some hoops for. Since Kaladesh, we've gotten lots and lots of vehicles, and I've done a top 10 on the subject of all vehicles if you're curious. There are also a whole lot of legendary vehicles though, which tend to be important conveyances from the Magic story. In all, there are 31 legendary vehicles in Magic, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's the Belligerent, which was Vraska's ship on the plane of Ixalan. For 2 generic, a blue and a red, it's a 5/5 vehicle with crew 3, and when it attacks you create a treasure token. And until end of turn, you may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. While the Belligerent isn't the most efficient vehicle ever when it comes to its casting and crew cost, that attack trigger is some pretty serious business. You effectively get to draw a card every time it attacks, and the treasure it spits out makes it more likely that you'll find a way to play whatever card you reveal, in addition to the fact that getting a random treasure can be pretty good value in general. Its 1 point came in a standard Grixis mid-range deck with a significant treasure sub-theme as a result of Magda the Horde Master. The Belligerent is still in standard now, and it has a shot at gaining some more points before it rotates, though it isn't exactly heavily played. At number 9, it's Weatherlight. This is probably the most iconic mode of transportation in all of Magic, since it was a skyship designed by Urza, and it played a major role in stopping the Phyrexian invasion of Dominaria. It even got a card way before vehicles were ever a thing, so once we returned to Dominaria after the introduction of vehicles, it wasn't too surprising that they decided to give us a version of the Weatherlight with the actual vehicle subtype. For 4 generic mana, it's a 4/5 flyer with crew 3, and when it does combat damage to a player, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, and you can reveal a historic card from among them, meaning an artifact, legendary, or saga, and you put that card into your hand. Kind of like the Belligerent, the stat line here isn't insane, but this combat damage trigger effectively draws you cards, and because it's a 4/5 flyer, you've got a pretty good shot at getting in with Weatherlight. So if your deck has a decent number of historic cards, this can do some serious work, and that's exactly what it did in Standard. Appearing in aggro decks, it had plenty of great cards to hit with this, like Scrap Heap Scrounger, Walking Ballista, and History of Benalia. In those decks, the Weatherlight could make sure you didn't run out of gas. However, it hasn't put up any top 8 since rotating out of Standard. At number 8, it's Ratchet Field Medic. Like all of the Transformer Universes Beyond cards, Ratchet is a double-face card that is a creature on one side and a vehicle on the other. For 2 generic and a white, it's a 2/4 with lifelink, and whenever you gain life, you can convert Ratchet. In other words, transform it. Why they decided to use that word instead of transform for, Transformers, I don't know. But anyway, the point is, he can become a vehicle when you gain life, and if you do that, you return an artifact with mana value less than or equal to the amount of life you gain this turn from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. He also comes with more than meets the eye, which effectively makes him a modal double-faced card. You can pay 1 generic and a white to cast it as Ratchet Rescue Racer, a 1/4 vehicle with living metal, which means it's a creature during your turn. Notably, it can't be crewed, so generally it's only a creature during your turn. It also comes with lifelink, and whenever 1 or more non-token artifacts you control are put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you convert Ratchet, but it only happens once a turn. So to sum up, Ratchet really likes artifacts and gaining life, and his ability to reanimate artifacts on the Ratchet side is particularly spicy. So spicy that Ratchet has seen play in the only 60-card formats he's legal in, Legacy and Vintage. In both, he's played as a singleton copy in Oswald Fiddlebender toolbox decks. These decks are super into low mana value artifacts and sacrificing them, and they run plenty of ways to gain life, like Shadow Spear and Haywire Might, so Ratchet has plenty of stuff to bring back. Ratchet may have the potential to gain more points in the Eternal formats in the future, but so far in 2023, it hasn't gained any points. At number 7, it's Weatherlight Completed, the second version of the skyship Weatherlight to make the list. The story behind this one is pretty clear. During the second Phyrexian invasion of Dominaria, during the events of Dominaria United, this vehicle that once helped end a Phyrexian invasion got captured by the Phyrexians, who completed it. For 2 generic mana, it's a 5/5 flying vehicle. Whenever a creature dies, you put a Phyresis counter on Weatherlight Completed, then you draw a card if it has 7 or more Phyresis counters, and if it doesn't, you scry 1. Lastly, if it has 4 or more Phyresis counters on it, it's a Phyrexian creature in addition to its other types. So like Ratchet's vehicle side, the Weatherlight Completed actually can't be crewed. Getting 4+ Phyresis counters on it is the only way to turn it into a creature. If you can pull all of that off though, we're talking about a 2-mana 5/5 flyer that draws you a bunch of cards, which is pretty insane. In 2022, Weatherlight Completed was played in both Standard and Pioneer. In both formats, it was played in Sacrifice aggro decks that used outlets like Oni Cult Anvil and Witch's Oven to sacrifice creatures for value. However, it hasn't put up any top 8 since 2022. At number 6, it's Cosima, God of the Voyage. Cosima is a Kaldheim god associated with travel, and like most Kaldheim gods, there's a legendary artifact associated with her, in this case, a vehicle, so she's a double-faced modal card. This means you can choose to cast either side. The front side is Cosima, a 2/4 for 2 generic and a blue, and every upkeep you can exile Cosima, and if you do, whenever a land enters, if Cosima is exiled, you put a Voyage counter on it. If you don't, you return Cosima to the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it and draw X cards. In other words, the creature side can remove itself from the board, or go on a voyage, for a while accumulating counters, and when she returns later, she gives you a bunch of value. You can of course also cast her as a legendary vehicle called the Omen Keel. This is a ship she lent to Kaya during her search for Vorinclex on the plane of Kaldheim. It's a 3/3 for 1 generic and a blue with crew 1. Whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles that many cards from the top of their library, and you can play lands from among those cards for as long as they remain exiled. Cosima is pretty good if you've got plenty of time to generate all of that value, but the Omen Keel can be great if you get it down early, especially because it's got good size for the cost and is very easy to crew. While it only steals lands from the opponent, making sure you hit land drops and still effectively drawing a card is pretty great. All of Cosima's points came in the Standard of 2021, where it was played in Dimir and Izzet control decks. She hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard. At number 5, it's Shorakai Genesis Engine. This Kamigawa Neon Dynasty vehicle is inhabited by one of the plane's mini Kami and piloted by Kotori. For 2 generic, a white and a blue, it's a massive 8/8 with crew 8, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it to draw 2 cards, then discard a card and create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token. Shorakai also happens to be the only full-time vehicle that can be your commander. Because Shorakai is from a commander set, the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage, and it sees regular play in Legacy blue-white control decks, where it sort of fills the role of a Planeswalker. That might sound a little bit strange for a vehicle, but like a Planeswalker, it doesn't directly impact the board and has a great value ability you can use every turn that adds to the board and generates card advantage, and on top of that, it can't be directly attacked like a Planeswalker can. These decks even win the game on occasion with a crewed Shorakai. Shorakai looks well positioned to continue to put up points in Legacy. However, the top 4 cards on this list are pretty much in their own tier because they have a massive lead on everything else, like the number 4 card, which is Parhelion 2. This is where the Boros Angels on the plane of Ravnica reside, and it's also a flying fortress. For 6 generic and 2 white, it's a 5/5 with flying, first strike, vigilance, and crew 4, and when it attacks, you create 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance that are attacking. 8 mana is a lot, but Parhelion definitely delivers, since it not only smashes in for 5, it gives you 2 huge angel tokens that stick around. Of course, if one actually had to pay 8 for Parhelion, it probably wouldn't have seen any competitive play, but there happens to be one really awesome way to cheat it into play in Pioneer, that being Greasefang Okiba Boss. This creature lets you reanimate a vehicle at the beginning of combat, and it has the exact 4 power that Parhelion needs for crewing. So in that deck, you can get Parhelion into play on turn 3 pretty easily, and while Greasefang does bounce the vehicle it reanimates to your hand at the beginning of the next instep, those angel tokens aren't going anywhere. Greasefang decks have been at the top tier of Pioneer for more than 2 years at this point, and it doesn't look like that's going to change, but the 3 cards ahead of it on this list are also active and have much higher scores than it does, like the number 3 card, which is Isaka's Chariot. This is a chariot used by the Kaldheim god Isaka, who rides it throughout the cosmos. For For 3 generic and a green, it's a 4/4 vehicle with crew 4, and when it enters, it creates 2 2/2 cat creature tokens, and when it attacks, you can create a token that's a copy of a token you control. While the stat line and crew cost aren't normally what you expect from a 4-mana vehicle, the Chariot more than makes up for that by generating 2 2/2 bodies up front. These bodies can of course crew the Chariot, and you can also make copies of them when it attacks. The Chariot has been heavily played in both Standard and Pioneer. In Standard, it was played in aggressive and non-aggressive green decks alike, which usually had some pretty juicy tokens to make copies of, like 4/4 Trolls created by Old Growth Troll and Ren and 7's huge Treefolk token. The Chariot sees play in a wide variety of decks in Pioneer too, including Devotion to Green and Gruul Aggro, but it's also played alongside Parhelion and Greasefang decks. While it's not quite as game-breaking as Parhelion, getting it down early and getting that ETB gives you a similar effect, and it's actually castable in the later game, at which point it can also copy some Parhelion Angels if need be. The Chariot is well positioned to keep racking up points in Pioneer, and the card right in front of it is less active, so it may eventually claim the number 2 spot on this list. For now though, that card is Heart of Kiran. This Kaladesh airship was used by the Renegades during the Plains Ether Revolt. For 2 generic, it's a 4/4 with Flying Vigilance and Crew 3, and you can also remove a loyalty counter from a Planeswalker to pay for its crew cost. This is huge and imposing for 2 mana, and while the crew cost isn't entirely optimal, the fact you can get around it entirely by using a loyalty counter is a pretty big deal. The combination of Flying and Vigilance also means your opponent has to account for it on your turn and on their turn in a big way. Basically, you can crew it for free in the right deck, and the downside is still a pretty efficient aerial beater. Since it's colorless, it was pretty easy to slot into decks in Standard, and it showed up in most decks that had a decent combined number of Planeswalkers and creatures. It was at its best in decks that had various artifact synergies, like the vehicle decks of that Standard format. It often felt like a staple in Standard, for example, appearing in 7 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour Ether Revolt. It's also gained some points in Pioneer, where it really caught on in Devotion to Green decks for a while. These decks use lots of Planeswalkers, including Karn the Great Creator, who could also grab it from the sideboard when you really needed an aerial finisher. But Karn got banned, and the more recent Devotion decks no longer run so many Planeswalkers, so it doesn't have any points since 2023, and it currently doesn't have a home in any format. And at number 1, it's Sky Sovereign Console Flagship. This is Magic's very first legendary vehicle, and it's the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of Kaladesh's governing body, the Consulate. For 5 generic mana, it's a 6/5 flyer with Crew 3, and when it enters or attacks, it does 3 damage to target creature or Planeswalker an opponent controls. So, Sky Sovereign is a massive flyer that can end the game quickly, and it gives you removal up front and keeps blasting things into oblivion every time it attacks too. That all makes this flagship really tough to beat. Like Heart of Kiran, it saw heavy play in Standard, and while the fact it was significantly higher in mana value prevented it from being quite as ubiquitous, it has caught on in a much more significant way in non-rotating formats. In Pioneer, it's been played in decks that we've already mentioned, like Devotion to Green and Greasefang. In Modern, it's often played in Tron decks, which can power it out on turn 3 without much trouble. And in Legacy and Vintage, it's played in artifact decks that lean on fast mana to get out crazy strong colorless cards in the extreme early game, like Sky Sovereign. Sky Sovereign is going to remain the number 1 legendary vehicle for the foreseeable future. So, those are Magic's top 10 legendary vehicles. If you want to own any of these awesome modes of transportation, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at various legendary permanents, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.